They rose like medieval castles against desolate horizons, stone shoulders and copper crowns, windows stacked like watchful eyes. Pause. Early 20th century mental hospitals did not ask to be noticed. They insisted. Their long wings unfurled from a central spine like a bat at rest, a geometry meant to quiet storms of the mind. This was the age of the Kirkbride vision, a certainty laid in brick. The building itself is a cure. Beat towers lifted into weather. Corridors ran like rails. Lawns were shaved to velvet. From afar, salvation wore a Gothic smile. Up close, the doors were heavy, and the air smelled faintly of soap, coal, and secrets. Buffalo's sandstone stretched until the eye grew tired of counting. Two copper-topped towers bit the sky, green with age, patient as centuries. By morning, sunlight slid down their flanks and pooled in the gravel paths. By evening, the towers drank the last light like kings who never spoke. Inside, footsteps rang in the long halls and then vanished into stone, as if sound itself learned obedience. The ledgers spoke the language of confidence, the plan, the cost, the brick, the miles of pipe, facts arranged like soldiers. But the wards spoke another language, the rustle of sheets, the tremor in a hand that would not be still, the sigh of a nurse at 3 a.m, the whisper of a prayer that had forgotten its words. Pause at Worcester. Corridors almost a mile long promised order by distance. Classify, separate, observe, as if suffering might respect a floor plan. Beat doors opened onto rooms where beds lay close as books on a shelf, page against page, story against story. In winter, the walls wept. In summer, the air sat heavy and close. At the far end, always the far end, the rooms for those deemed violent, cells barely larger than a box, where a man's life narrowed to a loop of hours and the small radius of his own pacing. Time learned to walk in circles there. Danvers sat like a stern ancestor on its hill, a spine of brick and slate. The central tower could be seen for miles, a reminder and a warning. Tunnels threaded beneath like veins, carrying heat, laundry, coal, food, and, discreetly, the dead. Beat. At night, rats scurried with a kind of desperate confidence, as if even vermin knew there were too few eyes for too many bodies. Numbers swelled until arithmetic became cruelty. 40 where 20 should sleep, one doctor where 100 wanted to be seen. The system bowed and did not break, because it had been built not to feel. Pause. Greystone unfurled a facade so vast it seemed to hold up the sky. From the road, it looked like Europe misplaced. Mansard roofs, a parade of windows, the solemn weight of intention. Inside, beds stood head to foot, breath braided with breath, dreams colliding. The air carried the mineral scent of disinfectant, the human notes of sweat and fear, the faint metallic whisper of keys. Beyond the walls, farm fields worked by patient hands moved toward self-sufficiency. Rows of cabbages and beans, milk warm from the udder, the steady clip of hooves and the customary nod from a man who did not earn a wage for what he did all day. The ledgers called it therapy. The sun called it labor. Pause at Pilgrim. Time itself wore a uniform. 5:30 woke the building. 6 plunged bodies into cold. 6:30 measured breakfast by the minute. 7 made the wards shine. 8 sent the healable into air and the unhealable back into rooms that learned to swallow sound. The kitchens roared like factories, steel counters, roaring ovens, carts squeaking over tile, an urn brewing enough coffee for a small town. The plan was meant to calm by predictability. Beat the plan forgot that sorrow does not own a clock. Pause. Across the hills of West Virginia, limestone blocks stacked into corridors straight as rulers. Windows marched in files. The ceilings were so tall a person might feel small enough to behave. Categories multiplied like labels in a museum. Acute melancholia, religious mania, paranoia and gradations. Each promised its own room and regimen, as if a name could keep company with pain. Down the years, the rooms filled beyond their measure. 200 spaces held 2,000 souls. Inspectors wrote sentences that tried not to shake. Camarillo traded Gothic spires for white stucco and arcades of shade. Sunlight flooded courtyards where orange trees glowed and shadows lay quiet as cats. It looked like gentleness, and sometimes it was. Beat, but stone cannot keep its promises by itself. A man might be left alone on a bench, unvisited, unspeaking, the beauty around him like a painting he could not enter. The campus kept its own police, its own fire, its own small city, and the hum of self-containment became a kind of philosophy. We have everything we need, including you. Pause money bent the rules of mercy. At McLean, some rooms had curtains chosen by someone who knew what a shade of blue can do to a morning. A private nurse set a tray with hands that did not tremble. Down the corridor, the public ward carried too many bodies and not enough air, and a poem scrawled in a notebook had to fight for a little quiet in which to become itself. Beat. Architecture flattered the eye, but stone was only ever stone. The cure, if it came from people. Pause. Traverse City flashed 1,000 windows at the sun, each arched and slightly different, as if the building were practicing the art of seeing. Trains delivered coal by the thousands of tons to keep the rooms warm enough for hope. Journalists came, took in the grandeur, and then asked to see the basements. There, hope shrank and the iron smells grew stronger, and the truth resumed its ordinary posture. A person strapped to a bed is not a theory, but a fact. Pause. In Washington, St. Elizabeth spread like a small nation, cottages and circles, experiments in sightlines and supervision. A single nurse standing at the hub could see many doors at once, as if attention might work best when it did not have to turn its head. Famous names passed through its gates, carrying either history or rumor, but inside the wards the fame washed off like rain. Everyone learned to sleep to the same mechanical lullaby of radiators and the far clank of keys. Pause treatments gathered like weather. First, the age of routine, the so-called moral treatment, rose with the sun, a bath, a prayer, labor measured as therapy, meals, more labor, silence, lights out. Order as medicine. Beat then came water used as force. Days held under a canvas cover in a tub gone cold. Showers that stitched skin with needles of hot and then cold. A man shivering into quiet while an attendant watched the minutes like a duty post. Pause electricity followed, clean and bright and certain. Jaw clenched, body arched, memory afterward thinned like fog. Some rose from the table calmer, some smaller, some changed in ways language could not hold. Doctors wrote numbers that suggested victory. The corridor learned a more complicated song. Elsewhere, needles drove sugar down into a pit and then hauled it back again, a dance with coma and revival set to the rhythm of a ward's clock. The chart said improved and relapsed, the way a tide says out and in. Pause. Then steel found a softer way into the skull, slipping behind the eye toward a promise with a terrible shine. Curtains drawn, breath held, the quick knock of bone. Afterward, quiet that did not mean peace, smiles that were not joy but absence. A white coat carried his instrument in a case and believed with an almost religious fervor. The years would bruise that belief, but not before lives bent along its path. Beat restraints had their own vocabulary, cribs as furniture and cage both, chairs that hugged and held until motion gave up, muzzles for hands called muffs, belts and buckles with polished holes from use. Isolation was labeled safety, and sometimes it was, but the day is long in a room where the light is always the same, and a mind left alone with itself can become either a chapel or a trap. As women learned how narrow the acceptable could be. Grief that lasted too long, opinions spoken too loudly, books read too hungrily, ambitions too large, the adjectives did the work of the lock. The word hysteria wandered across papers like a traveling circus poster, promising a spectacle and a cure. A doctor pressed where no one spoke of pressing and declared the mind reset. Cold water stung until tears stopped, and the stopping was considered progress. Beat, a girl who wanted to study engineering, wrote a letter that began, "I am not mad," and ended with a signature the world would not read. Pause. The buildings did not just contain bodies. They contained stories. A nurse wrote in a small diary each night, the spine creasing under her thumb. Today, I taught a man how to fold his shirt. He remembered the second sleeve. I did not cry in front of him. A patient memorized a bird's morning habits from a window, 3 hops, a tilt, 2 notes, and kept that knowledge like a coin. A janitor hummed the same tune for 30 years until the tune learned the corridors by heart. And yet, even as Stone insisted on obedience, people refused to be quiet forever. A woman walked into an island asylum pretending to be mad and wrote what she saw until the city blushed and opened its purse. A wife, locked away for the crime of questioning, cut her way back through law and made the door a little harder to close for the next woman. A former patient wrote about the nights his arms ached from restraint and would not let the country look away. Beat. A physician decided a person is more than a symptom and built treatment plans like biographies. Where were you? What happened to you? Who holds you up? What gives you breath? A nurse taught other nurses to speak softly and to listen as if listening itself were medicine. Pause. Social workers threaded families back into the clinical picture. Housing, work, a brother with a spare room, a church with a basement that smelled of coffee and second chances. Group rooms replaced some quiet rooms. Craft tables replaced some straps. Gardens replaced some empty yards. A man who had only ever been given orders was handed a packet of seeds and the choice of what to plant. He chose tomatoes. By August, he had more red than he could carry, and he gave them away with a shy pride that made the ward feel, for a week, like a neighborhood. A pause, the old certainty began to fray. Studies arrived like weather fronts. The numbers did not sing the songs the procedures said they would sing. Memory loss was not a side effect, but a theft. Comas cured less than hope did. Steele's promise dulled. Beat anesthesia softened shocks. Isolation shrank. Restraints had to explain themselves and often could not. A committee for mental hygiene signed its name to a new era. State houses stirred. Funds were found. Training changed. In some places, doors literally came off their hinges and were not put back. In others, the doors stayed, but someone began to knock before opening them. Pause, the hospitals aged. Copper went brown. Slate shed its surface in weather. Bricks learned the language of moss. Some buildings closed with a thud like a book finished and shelved. Others became condominiums, their grand staircases sold as charm. A few stood empty, windows punched out by boys with stones, the wind walking the halls like a final inspector. Tourists came with cameras. The floors complained. A guide whispered, "Here is where the laundry was done. Here is where the chapel stood. Here is where the keys hung on nails like little iron moons." Beat, the past did not leave. It waited politely in the corners, like a patient who has learned to be patient. Pause, but not all ghosts ask for fear. Some ask to be understood. Consider a ward where the night nurse kept a box of crayons for the ones who could not sleep. The drawings were terrible at first. Frantic circles, rain like knives, heads without faces. Months later, a picture of a tree appeared. A trunk, branches, leaves like green confetti. The nurse taped it to the office wall and did not say a word. The man who drew it smiled only with one side of his mouth, but he smiled. Pause. Consider another ward where a doctor replaced chart rounds with story rounds once a week. No diagnoses allowed, just who did you love, what did you build, what did you lose, what music do you hear in your head when you wake. The first week was awkward. The second week, a woman told a joke so filthy and perfect the room howled. The third week, a man admitted he wanted a dog. By the fourth, someone had found a rescue mutt with a ridiculous face who visited on Thursdays and sat like a priest among sinners, receiving confessions with his warm, uncomplicated presence. Beat, consider a woman in a quiet room who asked for a book and was told no, and asked again and was told no, and asked a third time and received a paperback with a cracked spine and a coffee stain shaped like a continent. She read until the ceiling lights made her eyes sting, and when the nurse came to collect the book, the woman said, "I want to remember something that belongs only to me." Paja, the nurse left the book. The nurse did not write it up. The nurse slept that day like someone who has done a small, precise kindness and will do it again. Architecture had promised what only attention can give. Attention, real, sustained, ordinary, stubborn, proved to be the one medicine whose side effects were welcome. Dignity, calm, the quiet return of a person's own outline. Eat, and yet the buildings teach even now with their ruined beauty. Beware of certainty without curiosity. Beware of grandeur that hides accounting. Beware the instrument that calls itself curative when held too tightly by a human hand. Past there were always people who would not let the century get away with itself. Dorothea walked jail to jail and wrote until legislatures started to hear the scrape of chains in their sleep. Pinnell unlocked wrists that had forgotten the color of sky. Tuke built a retreat where the wind moved the curtains and men learned to walk in gardens again. Packard took her fury to court and made the law lean toward the woman who said no. Beers told his own story with a candor that stripped the shame from it. Meyer put occupation into the marrow of care. Richards taught nursing as a craft of presence. Bly turned 10 days into a century's mirror. Fuller brought science without cruelty to bear on the question of what our minds are capable of, and what they cannot be asked to endure. Jarrett stitched the social fabric back into the clinical robe. Group therapy taught strangers to hold each other up for an hour at a time. Pause. The result was not a miracle, but a movement, and movements are made of Tuesdays as much as triumphs. On some Tuesday in 1915, a nurse untied a strap and did not retie it. On a Wednesday in 1920, a superintendent decided the word quiet meant garden, not dungeon. On a Friday in 1932, a doctor wrote, "No further shocks," and did not change his mind on Monday. Small mercies repeated become policy. Policy kept honest becomes culture. Culture, when it remembers its own failures, becomes wisdom. Beat walk the old corridors now if you can. The dust rises like a memory. The light has learned to spill differently across tile. If you listen, really listen, you can still hear the echo of a cart squeak and a laugh you did not expect, and somewhere, perhaps a song hummed under breath, a song no one taught the singer and no one can take away. Step into a courtyard where someone once sat alone and picture a different afternoon. The same bench, a volunteer reading aloud, two men arguing softly about baseball, a woman sketching a tree whose leaves look like green confetti. Pause. These places were built like fortresses, and yet the lesson they leave is not about walls. It is about what survives them. A hand offered without force. A question asked without suspicion. A plan made with the person, not for them. The slow rebuilding of a life with the patient as carpenter. Beat control is not compassion. Routine is not recovery. Stone is not solace. Dignity is the only true medicine that works at every dose. So let the towers stand in our memory, copper fading through the shades of time. Let the windows gleam in old photographs, the lawns still and bright. But do not be fooled by the castles. Pause. If there was ever a cure inside those walls, it was carried in by people, the nurse with the crayons, the doctor who asked a better question, the social worker who found a sister's address, the janitor who learned everyone's favorite song and whistled it on night shift, the patient who planted tomatoes and gave them away. Beat, they were the instruments. They still are, and if you pass an old asylum on a hill and feel a pull in your chest, stop for a moment. Imagine the mornings and the midnights, the way a building can hold both harm and hope, how a century can teach with both hands, one cruel, one kind. Pause, then carry the kinder hand forward. Into clinics, into homes, into law and training and the ordinary rooms where help is given and received. Carry it carefully, as if it were breakable. Because it is, and because it is everything.